It's a great day to be alive in Austin, Texas. That's almost always the case, other than when the city council's meeting. And I'm the guy who reminds our staff to be well behaved, so there I go. No, it's the summertime. It's a great time to be in Austin. It's always fun to be inside this building, particularly when we have an event like this one. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. This is stop 6 or 7 or 8 on our State of the Taxpayer tour. We will be in 13 cities when it's all said and done. We've been to the big cities, we've been to the small cities, we've been to Steak Restaurant in Abilene, some nice places in Fort Worth and Dallas. Of course, we love being here at what we call the mothership, an increasingly used phrase here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation because, as you may know, we've recently opened a DC office, which is known as States Trust, and we do that not because the swamp is a great thing, but because the swamp needs to be drained, and Texans probably have the best idea of how to do that. If we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts. I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. As we like to say, we have two forms of currency. One of them, which would not surprise you as a think tank, is ideas, and we're going to talk about them today. Those ideas turn into research and policy solutions, and if things go well, really good policies passed by the legislature. We'll talk about that. Our other form of currency would be our people, and in fact, they're even more important. And so you're going to spend some time today with 4 of our people, policy experts who not only know what they're talking about regarding their particular issues, but also people you would want to know. And that's really important to us because in addition to doing research on our large set of policies, it is significant in any society that we understand how to have discourse civilly. And so if you've been to our events, you know that's one of our calling cards, or at least we try for that to be. In other words, we want people to have a good conversation. We want legislators to have a really important debate. And rather than think that disagreement, that difference of opinion is a bad thing, we actually think it's a sign of a healthy civil society. And so we take great pride when we have conversations like this in having a question and answer session, which we will have, when people ask questions that may air a difference of opinion with us, or when we may pose a policy solution that, at least when we propose it, elected leaders don't quite agree at that moment. But I think what people have learned in our 30-year history is that we are cheerful warriors, and that in that difference of opinion is nothing personal. And so one of the things we're also known for is calling a spade a spade. And so what you're in store for today is, with great cheerfulness, a report on what happened in the legislative session and what didn't happen in the legislative session. As some of you know, I'm a historian, and so I just tend to be focused on facts, and the facts can be stubborn things. And if we were reporting on this session as a whole, we would say that something very typical historically happened. There were pieces of good legislation that were passed, and there were some missed opportunities. And by saying that, we're not making a political statement because we're just a 501c3 research institution. We have nothing to do with the important work that happens in campaigns and elections. You know that we work with members of any political party. Our criminal justice reform work, for example, which culminated in the passage of the First Step Act, the first federal reform in criminal justice in over 3 decades, required support from both parties. And we think that although many of our issues fall, of course, on the center right of the political spectrum, that we have a voice that probably amplifies what most Texans believe, which is that when you couple good old-fashioned Texas common sense with really good academic quality research, you end up with some really good ideas. And so today we're going to tell you the story of what happened in the session, at least on the priority issues that we were working on. We will save some time for you to ask some questions. We'll talk about the ground rules for that when that comes up. But most of all, I invite you to sit back and enjoy what our experts have to say. I'll introduce them here shortly, but figured that I would spend just a couple of minutes giving you a sense of some of the top issues of the session before diving into education, foster care reform, local governance, and the nefarious practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying. So it will not surprise you, given that we are known for our work on fiscal policy and economic research, that while we care deeply about all of our issues, one of the signature issues of the Texas Public Policy Foundation is the state budget. And we have put together over the years a mass of research and even an idea, which we call the Conservative Texas Budget. And the idea behind the Conservative Texas Budget is buttressed with unassailable economic research. And not because we did it, but because this is research that's peer-reviewed from economists around the country. This is research that is objective. We're looking at it just in terms of the dollars and cents. We leave it up to the elected leaders, and God bless them for being willing to serve and sacrifice in a part-time legislature, on what the priorities should be. But one of the roles we play is to determine at the conclusion of each legislative session whether the parameters of a conservative Texas budget were met or not. And doing so is important not because we say so, although we have great confidence in our research, but because of a really clear example of common sense. And it is this: no government should increase its annual spending at a faster pace than you and I can in our family budgets. Because if they do, just think about this. Put politics and ideology aside. If any government does that, who has to pay for the delta? Who has to pay for the difference? You and I do. And so necessarily spending beyond those responsible parameters means that there is going to be something bad that happens with taxation. And either taxes will go up or potential tax reform will be more limited. And so when we say that, unfortunately this year, the parameters of the conservative Texas budget were not met, we understand that there were some significant pressures on the state budget. Hurricane Harvey and its aftermath being one of them. We're very generous people, and so we took those Hurricane Harvey costs out of the conservative Texas budget parameters. We also believe that when money is being given back to its origin, which would be you, in the form of property tax relief, we not include those numbers either. And yet, even after we do that, you can see the significant increase in spending from one biennium to the next. It is up for the voters and for the legislators and their staff to determine if, in hindsight, those decisions were the most prudent for Texans. That's almost a political calculus which we don't engage in. All we're saying is that we know from our research here in Texas and in many other states that when government spends within its means, then it can sustain the kinds of reforms that make Texas, Texas. And so even though we celebrate, as you will hear today, the landmark reforms in property tax relief, especially in school finance reform, some of the progress made in foster care reform, tremendous progress in stopping the overreach against liberty by local governments, we also understand that in order to sustain the Texas model, we have to be spending at a fiscally responsible level. And so we will continue to talk about that because you and I can't be overspending our family budgets without some sort of repercussions. So one of the big reforms that happened this year in the legislative session was property tax reform. This is something that I think has gone slightly underappreciated by the average Texan because there were a lot of issues that were covered in the legislature. Each of you has your own set of issues that may be in a different priority level than the person sitting next to you, and we understand that. From our vantage point, this issue of property tax is crucial to the future of Texas, not because it's the end-all, be-all issue, but because of the nature of how we fund government, particularly at the local level. And it is not hyperbole to say that what the legislature put in motion regarding property tax reform this session is historic. They should be lauded for it, even though we really don't get into either celebrating or criticizing individual legislators. This is significant. If 2 or 3 years ago you asked the conservative groups in Texas if they would get the reform that you see there, $5 billion in property tax reduction, cities and counties being having to live with a 3.5% election trigger, so in essence, a ceiling on what they can spend, and independent school districts having a 2.5% ceiling, we would have jumped in the air and said, yes, sign us up for that. And so if you're sort of keeping score in your own private way, taking notes today, I would suggest to you, humbly, on behalf of TPPF, that this is a significant reform, the effects of which we will feel soon. It's a beginning. And so in 2021, there's a wonderful opportunity for the legislature to return and double down on that reform. They really did a tremendous job in getting started. They're not going to be able to do that, to connect these dots, if they continue to spend beyond the parameters of the conservative Texas budget. With that in mind, I'm going to turn this over to people who are much smarter, and a couple of them much better looking than I am. I'll let you decide who they are. And you will enjoy what they have to say. They're going to speak for a few minutes. We've worked hard on these presentations to make sure that they're very pithy, so that at the end of all this, you can ask your questions. First, immediately to my right is Emily Sass, our policy analyst in the Center for Innovation and Education. She's a native of Northeast Texas. She is very humble, so she wouldn't tell you that she is a piano virtuoso. And we know here, as many legislators do, that even though Emily really is as sweet as she looks, don't mess with Texas. To the right of Emily is Andrew Brown, one of our newest colleagues. Against his better judgment, he decided to go to law school. He's an attorney. He is the director of our Center for Families and Children. Andrew has been a tremendous addition to TPPF because he brings experience from another great research organization, the Foundation for Government and Accountability, and stands at a really important nexus, if you will, in modern society, and that is between government centralization and people on the sidewalk level, community-based groups, trying to provide services for the most vulnerable. And we're very proud at TPPF, in addition to all of the other work we do, of the work that Andrew is doing, because we always try to remind ourselves, let's move beyond just talking about dollars and cents and policy and laws. Let's also bring a face to the policies we're working on. And you'll hear from Andrew's comments that that's precisely what he's doing. To the right of Andrew, another attorney, Shelby Sterling, who in her first session here at TPPF was part of a lot of tremendous successes. Shelby is a policy analyst in the Center for Local Governance. In essence, that center is focused on putting local government back in its box. And understandably, for those of you who live in the city limits of Austin, we might be a little focused on that. Because every day you wake up, especially if the city council met the night before, you have fewer liberties than the day before. And each time one of those liberties is taken away, it's going to cost you more the next day. Well, Shelby is someone that you can give a high five to after this session, because even though she would not take credit, and it's certainly not our organizational desire to take credit for anything, she deserves a lot of praise for many of the successes that she was part in. And obviously the folks who deserve the most praise are the elected members, who are the folks who have to take the hard votes on some of those pieces of legislation. And last but certainly not least, a gentleman whose face you would recognize if you ever tune into Fox News, Mr. Chuck DeVore. Very fittingly, he's sitting all the way to the right, especially if you ask his former colleagues in the California Assembly. Chuck, like many of our TPPF folks, has this wonderful ability to talk about pretty complicated policy issues at a common sense level, which is really good, because he's going to talk about something that continues to be a significant concern in Texas, and that is the practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying. With all of that said, I'll just ask you to answer this question. This is a rhetorical question. Be thinking about your answer to this as you're listening to these presentations. What is the state of the Texas taxpayer? And that's the first question we're going to take up during Q&A. But if you would, please join me in welcoming these experts.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here with you all today. I'm pretty sure I'm not in the smarter than Kevin camp, so I'm going to assume that he was putting me in the better looking camp. Although You never for sure. So I'm here to talk a little bit about education today, what we got, what we didn't get. Obviously, this was a huge session as far as education is concerned, so there's no way that we're going to be able to cover everything that happened. But I am going to hit a few highlights that we are particularly excited about. When it became apparent that the legislature, it was the intent of the legislature to put significant new dollars into public education spending, ultimately, that was around $6.5 billion. We released a piece that said, if you're going to put more money into education, here are 6 things that should be on the table for consideration that either put focus, on quality or increase transparency to the taxpayers who are footing the bill. I'm happy to tell you that 4 of those passed. One of them, the one that Kevin just talked about, made progress, and the 6th one that Chuck is going to address in depth had a beginning, and we look forward to making more progress on that in the future. So the first of the 4 that I'm going to hit is merit pay. We were very excited to see this included in the final bill. This means that great teachers will be able to earn great salaries for great work. Right now, most teachers are paid based on 2 factors, how many years they've been teaching and how many degrees they have. There's no allowance for excellent quality. Dallas has served as a little bit of a proof of concept here. They've been doing this for several years now in a kind of multi-layered system of merit pay, and you can see in the chart there that within the space of 1 year, from 2015 to 2016, they had double-digit gains in what we'll call the most important subjects, reading and math. And that's kind of unheard of, especially for an urban district with some of the student challenges that Dallas ISD has. It is a majority minority district and a majority economically disadvantaged district. So those gains are huge, and it wasn't just reading and math, it was also in subjects like science and history. And concurrently with those gains, you were seeing an even steeper drop in the other direction for discipline referrals. So Dallas is doing something right. They're getting urban gains that we have not seen in Texas for years, if ever, and we're hoping that this sort of merit pay will continue those trends in other places around Texas. So the concern was, if we pay great teachers more and we get more great teachers, won't it cost more? So superintendents were saying we're reluctant to do this because we're afraid there may be higher costs down the road. So what the legislature did with this program is they took some of that $6.5 billion and earmarked it and said, that shouldn't be your concern. If your concern is the fiscal side of this, we're going to make sure that's not the issue. This is earmarked for this. Get out there, start a program, and we're going to make sure that you've got the funds that you need to sustain this. Next, we have school board goals. Frequently and unfortunately, school boards don't talk about student academic achievement and progress. You can see why. I mean, obviously they have a lot of things that come up, but I would contend that it is far more important for school boards to talk about actual student achievement than the things that are perhaps more the tyranny of the urgent, such as who are we going to give the next building contract to, and are we going to be able to put AstroTurf in the football stadium this year, and do we need to update the design of the cheerleader uniforms? Unfortunately, this doesn't happen nearly as often as it should, and when you look at the actual, again, reading and math results for students in Texas, the results are rather concerning. So what the Texas legislature did is put in requirements that school boards develop 5-year goals for their district and annual goals in order to get to those 5-year goals, and delegate somebody in the district as part of the district administration to be responsible for making sure that we're making progress toward those goals. Those goals have to be posted on the school district's website, and the annual reports have to be posted as well, so that the public can be aware what the district's goals for the district students are, and whether or not they're actually achieving or making progress toward those goals. So this both puts focus on quality from the district administration level and increases transparency to local taxpayers and voters as to what's going on in their local school district. And then efficiency audits. There is a revenue growth cap placed on school districts, but they still have the ability to go and ask voters for a tax rate increase. This is something they've had for quite some time. They call it a TRE, or tax ratification election. That's where they go to the voters and they ask for an increased tax rate into the future. So if they have one of these, they can't for the next year or two, but when they do decide to have one, they will have to conduct an efficiency audit, which is not like a financial audit. It's not looking to see who's embezzling or if anybody's embezzling. But it's looking at how you could spend resources more wisely. Do the spending habits of the district make sense? Could we be leveraging those dollars that the district already has and is bringing in year over year more effectively? And if you look at that graphic, you'll see typically these efficiency audits are expected to bring in 10 times in savings the cost of the initial audit. So this is a particularly expensive audit for a larger district in Texas, and this initial outlay would have been somewhere between 1% and 2%, maybe even less, of their annual budget, but it would have resulted in a significant increased savings year over year for taxpayers. So the idea is they're going to have to conduct this efficiency audit and post the results and hold a public meeting on the results a month before a tax ratification election so that the public can be informed about what the spending habits of the district are and what could be done to improve those. And then the public will have the ability, 30 days later, to decide whether or not the district does genuinely need more funding on a continuing basis, or whether or not it might be time to implement some of these suggestions first and then reevaluate. And finally, school transparency. We were very pleased that the state's accountability system was maintained. If they were going to weaken the accountability system, this would have been the year to do it before a couple of final measures came into play. As you can see, we've got a lot of room to grow nationwide. So we think it's very important that we keep that academic transparency for Texas voters and taxpayers so that they can know across the board how kids in Texas are doing and how kids in their individual district are doing. There are things that are more important, especially in some cases, than what you make as a particular score on a particular test. But we want parents and families to be able to know how their children are doing in the school that they've been assigned to. With that, the path forward, somebody is going to be coming after all of those gains next session. It's just the name of the game. So we need to defend those advances made, and then return the conversation to advancing education choice. At the end of the day, having a public education system is trying to provide a good to all students in the state of Texas, and we think it only right that students in Texas be able to choose the best place for them to receive that educational benefit. So we think it's important to return the legislature's focus to making sure that students have the widest array of options available to them that is possible. Some good news there. Charter schools were able to beat back some things that would have limited their ability to expand and grow this session, but that's going to be a continuing battle. So stay tuned to that as well. Thank you very much. Andrew?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Andrew Brown, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director for the Center of Families and Children here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Our center works to strengthen families by focusing on community-based and liberty-minded solutions to some of the hardest problems facing children and families in our state. And everything that we do, the lens, if you will, that we run policy reforms through, is based on the foundational belief that families, and particularly strong families, is what makes for a strong and free society. So while much of our work focuses on reforming the child welfare system, we go even deeper to examine the root causes that lead to family struggle and particularly family breakup, and work to address those root causes. It's no surprise that many of those are rooted in economics and economic disadvantage, which is why this issue is so critical in my mind to the taxpayers. Our reforms can broadly be broken down into two main categories. First, protecting the fundamental rights of families to live their lives free from unnecessary and sometimes unconstitutional government overreach and interference. CFC and TPPF is one of the only center-right voices at the Capitol standing up for the rights of families against government overreach into that private realm. to direct the care, the education, and the upbringing of your own children. And the second area of focus is reforming the foster care system to make it more innovative and responsive to the needs of children. In those unfortunate situations where the Department of Family and Protective Services has to go in and protect a child from imminent danger and imminent harm, we believe that it's the local community, not government, that's best equipped to meet the needs of that child and to step up and to care for that child in those unfortunate circumstances. And I'm happy to report that we've made some significant progress this legislative session. There's also much more work that needs to be done in the future, and so I'll briefly break down a few of those areas. This session, we advanced reforms that were designed to make CPS investigations more fair and to focus those investigations in on children who are in imminent danger of harm while protecting the rights of innocent families who can unfortunately get swept up into this broad net that is often cast. And one of those families, if you've been paying attention to the news over the course of the last year, is pictured on the screen. It's the Bright family out of Houston, Texas. And they lived the nightmare of having their children unnecessarily removed from their custody for an unfounded child abuse accusation. And briefly about their story, it all began when their youngest fell in the driveway and hit his head. Like any parent, they rushed their child to the hospital to get care. And while they were in the hospital, a pediatrician who specializes in child abuse flagged the injuries as potentially indicating abuse rather than an accidental injury. From that point forward, the Brights were treated not as parents, but as abusers. CPS came in and investigated, and actually several weeks went by before the investigator even followed up with the Bright family. But when that investigator followed up, he did so by filing an emergency order with the court, claiming that the children were in imminent danger of harm, which was authorized, and he removed those children into foster care immediately. A few days later, the family went back to court to have that reviewed, and over the course of that hearing, it was discovered that that investigator had in fact lied under oath in order to get that emergency order. And the judge in that case ordered the immediate return of the children to their families, ordered that Child Protective Services have no contact with the family, and then issued an unprecedented sanction of $127,000 against the agency. I tell you this story because the reforms that we proposed this session could have prevented what happened to the Bright family. These comprehensive CPS reform packages would have clarified the statutory guidelines that frontline CPS investigators apply when they're making the decision on whether to remove a child from his or her family, and to consider the trauma, the emotional trauma that causes to a child when there's separation, and balancing that with the danger that actually exists to that child. We know from sociological and psychological research that the mere act of separating a child from their family, even if it's for a short period of time, has lasting negative consequences on that child's development and emotional health. The second piece of legislation was targeted at reforming the role of those medical professionals who do play a role in identifying and reporting suspected child abuse. Our proposed legislation would have required a second opinion in cases where you have a child that's medically fragile, that has an underlying condition that can be falsely diagnosed as being caused by abuse or neglect. Now, the point of this is to make sure that the state, when it does have to intervene, is doing so based on the most accurate information available, and that there's not some other reason that hasn't been considered before taking the detrimental step of removing a child from their family. Both of those reforms made progress. They received strong bipartisan support in committees, but unfortunately didn't make it to the floor for a vote in time before the session ended. We were successful in raising the conversation and raising awareness about many of these issues that up until this point weren't on the radar of legislators, and we'll be working during the interim with stakeholders to refine these reforms and potentially get them across the goal line next session. Now, a major area of focus where we made significant improvement this year was in the decentralization of our foster care system. During the 85th legislature in 2017, Texas took the unprecedented step of moving toward a community-based model of foster care, where local community organizations actually take the lead in providing foster care services for children who are removed by the Department of Family and Protective Services. What this means is that the services that are being provided to children are more innovative and they're more responsive to the needs of those children, and we're actually limiting the need to move children across the state of Texas by increasing foster home and adoptive home capacity in the local regions. There are 3 regions right now that are currently implementing the community-based model, and they're already seeing dramatic improvements in foster home capacity, innovations, and services provided. In Region 3B, which is centered in Tarrant County, they've actually increased the number of foster and adoptive homes available in certain counties, and especially in more rural counties, by upwards of 200% when you compare it with the legacy system under the centralized bureaucracy in Austin. That is massive improvement, and this is the vision for the future of foster care in Texas. This session, the legislature provided the funds to bring on 2 brand new regions and then to expand into the second phase of implementation in the 3 regions that are already operating. Community-based care operates in 2 stages. That first stage is startup, where you're recruiting foster and adoptive families and handling just the placements. Phase 2 is when the rubber really meets the road, when those local community organizations, nonprofits, churches, even medical providers are able to actually manage the cases and make decisions that are going to impact the lives of children for the future, whether that's returning home or being adopted out. It gives them more control over outcomes generated. So we are now moving into that second and most critical phase in the 3 regions that are already online, and we are going to continue to push for a greater expansion of the community-based model to every part of the state of Texas. The final piece of legislation that we were instrumental in getting passed this session will create more opportunities for children to find permanent, loving homes. If anyone in the room is a foster or adoptive family, you know how difficult it is to even get approved and to continue your certification because of the regulations that are imposed on you and the training requirements that you have to meet. What House Bill 2764, which the governor signed 2 weeks ago, does is it eases those regulations. It caps the number of training hours required of foster and adoptive families at 35 hours. And it also gives the child placing agencies, the organizations that are actually recruiting and approving these families, more flexibility in how the regulations are applied to families. The practical impact of this is you're able to maintain the really good foster and adoptive families because you make it easier for them to continue on, and you're able to bring in more high-quality foster and adoptive families because the barrier of entry is lowered without sacrificing child safety. So I would encourage you all to look into potentially becoming a foster and adoptive family, because it's now much easier to say yes, thanks to the work of the legislature this session. We made some really important gains this session in the area of families, and I'm hopeful for the future. Thank you all so much for being here today.
All right, great job, Andrew. I think that's some significant progress that definitely should be cheered again. My name is Shelby Sterling. As Kevin mentioned, I am the policy analyst with the Center for Local Governance. I always knew that cities had a lot of power. I mean, they fix the potholes that in the roads that I drive on every day. We have our counties, our schools. They have their hands in a lot of different things. But the one thing that I continually learn in this job, and as I keep researching local governments, is they keep expanding how many things they have their hands in. The reach of local governments is continuing far beyond what they were intended to do. And that is why I am very glad and proud to be at TPPF, to be able to help rein in those local governments that are just infringing on our daily rights that we have as citizens of Texas and of the United States. One issue that I was able to help my colleagues on and help the legislature with and help each and every single one of you is annexation. Now, this is a long fight, and as I've learned very quickly in the legislature, nothing happens overnight. But as Kevin also mentioned earlier, you could wake up the next day and your city just passed a new ordinance. Well, lucky for you and lucky for every citizen in Texas, annexation is no longer a problem. In the 2017 legislative session, they passed SB 6, which is the Texas Annexation Right to Vote Act. This effectively ended forced annexation in the largest counties throughout the state. But that wasn't enough. This session, we came back and I got to join my colleagues in fighting to expand the end of forced annexation to every city and county in the state. So now every single Texan in the state has their property protected, meaning that their city cannot come in and say, we're gonna take you up, we're gonna tax you, and we're gonna force you to comply with our municipal code. That's not a problem anymore, and I'm very happy to say that forced annexation is no longer a problem. And although there technically isn't a path forward because it's done, we did make some other significant great strides in property rights and protecting them. One of the things that we were able to work on was to preempt city regulation of building materials. Right before the legislative session, cities could also require you to build your buildings, build your homes with certain materials, but now the cities cannot come in and force you to do that. Now, while property rights are definitely one of our high priorities, so is local debt. In this area, we made a lot of significant reform, which I promise, although I could talk for a couple hours on some of these, I'm only restricted to 8 minutes, so lucky for you, I will try to keep it short. Did you know that local governments in the state of Texas, every city, county, ISD, municipal, they owe $354 billion in local debt? I can't wrap my head around what I could do with $354 billion. But to give you a rough estimate, that's around $12,500 per every man, woman, and child in the state of Texas. Now I can think about $12,000, that's easier to think about, but $354, what is your city doing with it? We don't know. And that's one thing that we were able to accomplish this session is increased transparency. So next time you go to the ballot box, things may be a little bit different. First of all, we were able to pass what is a voter information document. Now, what this document is going to do is provide you with more information on the local debt items that they're asking you to pass. What these might be are the very long, complicated ballot propositions that are asking for a couple $100,000 for this project or a couple million or billion for this other project. Well, this voter information document will give you more information on what those projects are going to be. In addition, independent school districts often ask for those very large proposition bonds, but they don't explain exactly what you're going to be voting for. You're going to have to vote for everything that the school district wants in one yes or no question. So that includes the school renovations, the new stadium, new band uniforms, and you have to say yes or no to every single one or none at all. Luckily now, you will also have separate ballot propositions. So schools will be required to separate out certain expenditures and certain projects so that you have more opportunities to say yes or no and not have to say yes or no to everything all at once. Additionally, there will be a new tax impact element statement on the bottom of these tax propositions. Now, we don't know whether that's actually going to tell you, yes, your taxes are going to increase by this much, but you will have the opportunity to know that your taxes will increase, or if you say yes to this bond proposition, your taxes might not increase at all. Another great reform for local debt is going to be the end of rolling polling. Now, what do I mean by when I say rolling polling? I mean if you're at a football stadium and you can vote right there while you're at the game to say yes to the brand new stadium that the school district is asking you for. That's no longer allowed. The legislature is implementing new restrictions and limitations on such rolling polling ideas so that local officials aren't allowed to target as many populations to get those passed. Now there's a lot more, but I'm going to end it with that one because there is a lot of local debt reform. But all were great, and an opportunity to give you a better voice and more knowledge to know what your local cities are spending all of your money on. Now, we may be able to have passed a lot of great things, and everything, even if it doesn't, even if we did not pass it, it turns into another opportunity. And one of those opportunities, is employment freedom. Many of you may know what this may be is paid sick leave, which Austin passed last year. As it stands, the City of Austin's ordinance is currently intertwined in a lawsuit. And so Austin's sick leave ordinance is not going to be taking effect in August. But the City of Dallas and the City of San Antonio, their ordinances will take effect later this year. Now, although we weren't able to pass all 4 of the bills that would allow for employment freedom, we can continue over the next 18 months to keep researching and working on the issue in order to make sure that every Texan is more aware of the problems that are happening and be able to make sure that every city is going to be treated the same. Every employer, every employee is going to be protected so that they can make their own choices. Thank you. And here is the great Chuck DeVore.
Thank you very much, Shelby. So, given that this is the capital city of Texas, I'm going to guess that the response to the next question is going to be a little more vigorous than we've seen in other cities so far on this tour. So by show of hands, how many of you, perhaps excluding members of TPPF or people who are actually lobbyists, how many of you have gone and testified before the legislature in person? Okay, not quite as many as you as I thought might have been the case. Now, a little easier question. How many of you have either called or written or emailed your legislators? All right, very good. Now, if you did that full time, if you got paid to do it, you did it a lot, and you were paid by a local government to do it, you would be a locally paid taxpayer lobbyist, right? That would be your job. Now, we saw when the legislature was considering that property tax reform that Kevin talked about to kick us off, when that hearing was occurring in the legislature, there were 29 people that testified against that reform that's going to result in more money in your bank account in the years ahead. 29 people testified against it. Not one of the 29 was an average citizen who showed up to Austin and said, "Yes, please raise my property taxes. I want to pay more, legislature, please." Now, who are these 29 people? Well, about a third of them were local elected officials, and that's perfectly fine. They're encouraged to come and share their concerns about legislation with the legislature. About a third of them were staff of local governments, and that's fine, you know. And about a third of them were taxpayer-paid lobbyists. So not one real average person was there to testify. Now, a number of lawmakers saw this and were a little concerned about this practice. So during the hearing that we had of one of the bills, House Bill 281 by Mays Middleton, which would have largely banned the practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying, along with Senate Bill 29 by Senator Bob Hall. Both of them ended up having the same language. At the first hearing for the Mays Middleton bill in the House, it was interesting to see that there were 4 people that showed up to testify against the measure. Of those 4, one of them was, and I can't make this up, they were the lobbyists for the lobbyists. I thought, man, how do you get a job like that? A lobbyist for the lobbyists? That's kind of cool, kind of in a weird sort of government way. And one of the things that lobbyists for the lobbyists argued was that a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying was somehow an infringement on the First Amendment rights of local government. And I thought, this is not how it's done. This is not at all how it's done. Governments don't have rights. They have powers. You have So we see in the Constitution in the First Amendment, right, that you have this right to petition for redress of grievances. Well, government doesn't have the right to petition itself for a redress of grievances. That's, again, an individual right. Now, what would these bans have done and what would they not have done? Well, first of all, the research. It took me about 3 days of poring over thousands and thousands of entries from the Texas Ethics Commission and compiling them into a spreadsheet so that you don't have to do that. I do work at a think tank. I am partial to spreadsheets. It's a weakness, I know. But we do it so you don't have to. And I found about $41 million in your taxpayer money was spent to pay for taxpayer-funded lobbying 2 years ago, in the session 2 years ago. Now, that money did not necessarily include the cost it took to analyze bills, because analyzing bills is not lobbying. Lobbying is when you show up and you talk to a lawmaker or their staff and you urge them to vote for or against measures or potential measures. That's lobbying in the state of Texas. It also did not include public relations work. It also did not include coalition building. These are not lobbying under Texas's definition. So the actual funds spent of your money to generally persuade the legislature to do what? To enlarge the power and the size of local government, the actual money spent was probably significantly more than $41 million. And as we saw with the testimony on the property tax reform, this can have a significant effect, since everyone testifying against the reform worked for local government as a hired gun lobbyist or as a staff member or as an elected official. Now, these bills would also not have prevented elected officials from sharing their concerns with lawmakers. You know, that is covered under the First Amendment. And that is a proper role of what they should be doing in a representative government like the one we have. It also would not have prevented staff from talking to lawmakers. Now, if they did it so much that it was their full-time job and they had to register as a lobbyist, well, then they probably would not have been able to do that as a full-time position. But both bills exempted invited testimony. So if a committee or a member wanted to hear from a city or a county or a school district and invited the superintendent to come down or someone who is their government liaison, that didn't count as lobbying because that's invited testimony. So we were very happy to see that the bill was able to get out of the Senate. It passed, as I recall, with 17 votes, got out of the Senate, went over to the House, and the House measure passed the House State Affairs Committee on a bipartisan vote. House member Richard Raymond voted for it. And so then, unfortunately, as often happens, things started to get bogged down. And we saw there at the very end where the bill was weakened with a series of amendments on the House floor and ultimately failed. However, not all is lost. Governor Greg Abbott has taken up the cause of this measure, and he's talked about it quite a bit. Talked about it on social media, talked about it in his speeches. He would like to see the practice abridged or banned. And more importantly, I think, the voters of Texas would like to see this practice ended. We contracted with the same pollster that works with Governor Abbott, and we asked 800 Texas voters in December of last year, so now just going on 7 months ago, and we found that 91% of Texas voters disagreed with the practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying. 91%. And of course, that means that you have broad agreement across both major political parties and across racial and ethnic lines. Now think about it, 91%, that means that 9% either weren't so sure or were in favor of the practice. And if you start to think about it and you add up the number of close friends and relatives of taxpayer-funded lobbyists, I think we might be able to figure out where that 2 or 3% in favor of the practice are coming from. So we think that there's plenty of support out there in the public for reforming this issue moving forward. And we believe, with the very close call that this bill had, and the fact that it did pass the Senate, that we got a vote on the House floor, and the fact that Governor Abbott is in favor of reform, we think augurs very well for an opportunity to curtail this practice in a future legislative session. So with that, I'd like to invite Kevin Roberts to come back up front, and we're going to hear from you and what you think. Thank you very much.
Who says think tank people are boring? We just have the best jobs in the world. So great job. We're going to turn the questions to you here in just a moment. I said I'd pose the first question, which is, what is the state of the Texas taxpayer? And I'm going to answer my question, but we're interested in your opinion. We would say that the state of the Texas taxpayer, like the state of every American taxpayer, has been very strained because of the growth of government since the 1930s. The legislature, the governor, the lieutenant governor deserve a lot of credit for beginning to mitigate that strain in this last session. And I think you heard from the presentations of my colleagues that those are important foundations for the future, but it's essential in the interim leading up to the next session that we double down on those reforms. So with that said, we're going to turn to you, and keep in mind the rule here, which is that your statement needs to be short and end with a question mark. So we have a couple folks with microphones down here on the first floor, the wonderful Clint and Lucy, upstairs Emily, and so we'll just sort of rotate around there and enjoy your questions. We'll take as many as we can. Ma'am, we'll start with you. Just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Thank you, guys. You're awesome. You've walked me off the ledge many times as an unhappy Austin resident. But my question is for Shelby. Shelby, we were annexed really recently prior to the law, not quite in time to save us. And, you know, at first I thought it was fine, you know, oh, okay, well, we use the city services and stuff. We were annexed by Austin, but now I see what that really means. And my question is, y'all have floated something about going on to do something about disannexation, and if you could amplify what your plans are for that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Shelby?
Yes, so I know my colleague James has worked on annexation for a very long time, and to be honest, I don't know where we're going with disannexation. I know that we are going to continue working on the annexation and disannexation issue, although at this current moment in time, as we're still finalizing everything that we're talking about for the next 18 months and what our focus is going to be, I'm not sure exactly what that plan is going to be just quite yet.
Great question, and Shelby, wonderful response. One of the values for us in doing this tour, especially getting outside Austin, is to listen. So we think you might be interested in hearing our presentations. We really key in on the questions that are asked, and we do this very early in the interim, because as a think tank, we can't say anything publicly unless we've done research. And so your question has probably elevated as a potential priority some research on disannexation. So thank you. Take a question from this side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it. Mr. DeVore, we're both immigrants, and for obvious reasons, we found the place of nirvana. One of the things that all four of you have to be very careful of, for Californians who have been there and done that, from the state of socialism with a capital S, is that once you close a door or attempt to, they reinvent the semantics. You know, in taxation, after Prop 13, it became fees and assessments, just replaced all the taxes. When it came to property annexation, they changed it to sphere of influence. Wasn't in the law, but they could still take you because of this new dynamic. When it came to child protective services, it came to community homes that turned out to be hellholes. When it comes to education, you just keep merchandising the same people. They retire, they set up an LLC, turn around and go to the schools and tell you how it should have been done when they were there, but it wasn't done. Okay?
Great statement. What's your question?
My question is this: beware of the semantics.
Question mark. Chuck, why don't you take that one? Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. Well, I think that points out a problem, which if you go even back to the founding of the nation, you'll see the founding fathers were concerned that the growth in government is kind of a natural inertia. This constantly happens, and as government grows and its power grows, the sphere of liberty shrinks. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, now 3 legislative sessions ago, as I recall, I think 6 years ago, we developed the conservative Texas budget, because there needed to be very clear markers set down as to how big government was getting in Texas. And one of the fascinating things that I've been able to look into, to your point, is the U.S. Census Bureau does something called the Census of Governments, which looks at local and state government spending and revenue, as well as the federal funds that come in. And one of the things I thought was very fascinating was if you compare the 2 biggest states where 1/5 of Americans live, you'll see that at the state level, Texas is more or less, from 2006 to 2016, the most recent year, more or less within the population plus inflation limit, a little higher than we'd like to see it. California, of course, is quite a bit more. But at the local level, where there is actually more government proportionally in Texas than in California, because we're more decentralized here, about 45% of state spending is at the state level, 55% is at the local level in Texas. In California, it's 52 state, 48 local, so they're more centralized. At the local level, though, you see that local Texas government at all levels is spending just about as fast over that 10-year period as is California when you take into account population and inflation. And that's why I think it's so important that we finally see some brakes on local government spending increases that were put into place by the legislature this session.
I agree entirely. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, ma'am, for that excellent question. We're going to go to the higher level of heaven here, up to the balcony. Anyone have a question? Oh, you're going to lose your chance, and I'm not going to look up there again. Yes, sir.
I guess this deals with the local debt issuance question. It's Stacy, is that your question? I have is, my understanding is these local, whether it be cities, counties, school districts, when they issue these bonds, and they, I know you said there's some changes this legislative session on how they put those descriptions in there, but my understanding is these cities, especially the city of Austin, but I think it's true across the whole state, even though they pass the bonds for whatever the purpose is stated in there on the ballot, they don't have to follow that they can take these bond monies and then reallocate some of them to other, I guess you'd say, purposes that they want to use this bond money for. I guess the question I have is, are y'all aware of that, and are you trying to do something to maybe stop that sort of thing? To me, if you have a bond issue on the ballot and you vote for it, I don't know, build new roads, buildings, school buildings, whatever, that's what the bond money should be used for. But my understanding is those schools and I understand the cities are really bad about this.
They are, sir. Thank you very much for that question. I think it's an important issue. Shelby, you want to start with that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the local debt issues that I did not get to touch on in the 8 minutes that I had was actually
We're going to give you
issue.
30 seconds here.
Okay, here we go. I'm ready for it. But actually, one of the issues that was passed by the legislature deals with a portion of the issue that you just mentioned. What it seeks to do is make sure that the school districts, as far as the bond propositions that they put out, they will have to come back to the voters to reallocate that money. So if they want to spend it on another project that it's not actually what it was not actually allocated for in the first place, they have to get permission to do so. Now, as far as the cities and counties go, I do not believe that any legislation was passed to curb that as it was with the ISDs. But it's always an issue that could be talked about and worked on in the future.
Chuck, any cautions you would add to that based on California experience?
Well, I would just add on to that the certificates of obligation problem that we're seeing, where when cities or other local jurisdictions get turned down or are afraid that the voters won't approve some goofy project, they turn to certificates of obligation, which were never designed to fund long-term capital projects. What they're supposed to be for is to smooth out revenue shortfalls often caused by the seasonal nature of local government revenue, often through property taxes, which tend to come in more frequently at certain times of the year. And if a city or a school district has some sort of a shortfall, then they issue these certificates in anticipation of the future revenues, not for some new project that would otherwise require voter approval. So that needs some work as well.
Well, thanks, Chuck and Shelby, for a good response, and thanks, sir, for that question. Come right down here. Yes, ma'am. Microphone is coming your way.
Thank you so much. I think what you do is so important.
Thank you.
Also escaped California. But I'm just a regular citizen, and I find that most people I talk to don't know about you. So I'm wondering if you have plans to expand your sphere of influence or how you get a bigger audience. Because
Sure.
what you're doing is amazing, right?
Great question. You see, they're looking at me. So I guess I have to answer that question. Great question. You know, it's a catch-22 because we adhere to a lot of Reagan principles, and one of them is perhaps the most important, that when you don't care who gets the credit, you get more done. And that's one of the secrets of our success. We also don't presume future success. But the second thing is, because we have the privilege every day of walking into this building and nurturing principles that y'all are responsible for cultivating. We actually get to amplify them in the legislature. And because those principles are under greater and greater threat, that's not hyperbole, it's true. It has caused us to think that in addition to the work we do in research and advocacy kind of behind the scenes, we also need to do even more work in interacting with grassroots folks around the state. And that's why, as I said to begin with earlier today, we do this event in steakhouse restaurants in West Texas, and we're going to do that more. And what's interesting is each one of those events, someone has asked that kind of question. So we hear you loud and clear. We're working on that. We need to be better at that. And one of the best ways that we can expand our reach is for y'all who are really satisfied with what we do to tell your friends, to enhance what we're doing on social media. And the last thing I will say before pitching back to some other questions is that an underappreciated part of the foundation is that we have this wonderful communications team that we have built, and it has the sophistication and the ability of a national campaign. And we did that on purpose, even though we don't do campaigns and elections. Think of each of our issues as a campaign, and we can go out and send a video team and really capture the story of people. And the more we tell stories of people, rather than just issue white papers, which is also important, the more our reach expands. So thanks for the question. All right, against my better judgment, I'm going to go to the left side of the room, at least from my point of view, and Lucy will catch this gentleman right here in the middle.
Thank you for all you do.
You're welcome.
One request, one question. I'm hoping next session TPPF pick up the ball on school choice.
Sure.
Missing in this session, totally.
Sure.
So the question I'd like to present, I'm not sure who to address is.
We'll pitch it to Emily.
Well, no, it's not about school choice, but SB 11 that did pass, a little disappointed in it. I'm not even sure it passed.
Remind me what that was.
The consortium, mental health consortium.
Yes.
Talk about state of the taxpayer. That's a large chunk of money,
Yes.
and what are we trying to do with it?
Fair question.
Like
Emily and Andrew may want to add to that, but go for it.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. Historically, that's not been something, student mental health has not been something that we've had the bandwidth to cover and weigh in on, although Andrew may have something to add as well. In the Education Center, we've been more focused on school choice, school finance, things like that. It is a significant chunk of money, and I know there were some concerns about the process of implementation, what that actually means for school children and families across the state of Texas. It's going to be very interesting to see how that is actually implemented over the next few years. Yeah.
And just to follow up on that, it was something that we were aware of, and given our limitations as the 501c3 research institution, we don't comment publicly on things that we haven't published research on. It's something we are digging into. We didn't have research published on the topic during session. We did watch it very closely, and we're watching it specifically from the Center for Families and Children angle on how does SB 11 actually impact parental rights. And I say parental rights, but really it's family rights, the rights of children and family to live their lives free of government-funded social engineering. And that's what we're going to be really carefully considering as SB 11 is implemented. Obviously, mental health is a huge concern lately with some of the school shootings and other issues that have come up across the country. Mental health is a huge issue for kids in foster care, as I was saying during my comments. There's a significant negative impact on the mental health of children when they're separated from their families. So that's an issue that we will be watching closely over the interim.
Great question. Thank you. Come back down. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I was wondering what you all do or how you're looking into things with more of an innovative bent to it.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the processes of system redesign as far as things like from a conservative fiscal standpoint, when you do government contracting, a lot of times I would go in and in October, they're just spending all that money because they need to spend all that money so that they can get their budget for the next year, right? So if we're looking, maybe we can solve some of our fiscal problems that way by making it to where they don't have to do something like that, right? Where they can carry over their budgets and then they're not dinged, there's reasons why that they need their budget for the next year.
Sure.
And then I've been doing work myself. I'm actually a whistleblower who won against UT Dallas, and they just got in trouble in February for the same thing I reported them on in 2012. And so that brought me down here to do activist work. And so I'm finding out things like the Capitol is not allowed to use a project management system. I'm a former project manager, and I'm horrified. Most of the chief of staffs don't know what a project management system is. They think it's a voter ID roll. They don't know that they can take an email and turn it into a task. And
So how can we find better efficiencies in government, and what role can TPPF play in that? It's a really good question.
Right.
Chuck he certainly has the most experience with this, so we'll pitch to him. But I will say, one of the underappreciated reforms this session is the efficiency audits that Emily talked about. And it is really important for people like you who are willing to be as engaged as you are to hammer on that with your members, with their staff, and also with administrative agencies, because that's where really good ideas go to die. And that one will die if people like you and people here don't go fight for it. But on the larger question, Chuck, you see any opportunities there?
Yeah, we've done some research on those issues over the past decade, and two things stand out that unfortunately we haven't gotten a lot of traction on. One of them would be zero-based budgeting, and the other would be addressing Texas's use of what's called strategy-based budgeting or funding. If you look at the latter first, that was put into effect, as I recall, about 30 years ago, with the express political purpose of strengthening the legislature's hand over the governor to make it more difficult for the governor to veto line items that the governor didn't like in a budget. So in Texas, you have these strategies that are put together that make it very difficult to understand at a granular level how the money is being spent, how many people is it funding, et cetera, because it's basically funding initiatives or things, like health and human services, right? And because the budget is passed at that high level, it really ties the governor's hands in being able to line out certain forms of spending that the governor deems excess. That was done on purpose by the legislature to amplify their power. We have a separation of powers in our form of government. It's the way it's supposed to be. So it's probably going to be difficult to convince the legislature to give up that power in the name of fiscal prudence. Now, zero-based budgeting is another interesting innovation. It was done last, in fact, led by a person who works for us, former House member Talmadge Heflin, when he was chairman back during the difficult fiscal crisis, I think in 2003. And zero-based budgeting basically says, look, government, we're not going to assume growth based on your service level and inflation from the previous year. What you need to go is go back to zero and show us everything in statute that requires you, government entity, to do something, right? Where have you been ordered to do something? And then justify from zero to the ground up your budget. This has been done at various times at levels of government throughout the country. Beginning in the late 1970s, ironically, actually early 1970s, ironically under Jimmy Carter when he was governor of Georgia. It is a very difficult process, and as a result should probably only be done at each agency level every 6 to 10 years because it's very, time consuming. But that's something that we've been advocating and that we've looked into.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks for that question. I have time for one more question. We'll go to the gentleman standing in the back, Lucy. Since he's been standing, we'll give him precedence here. Yes, sir.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you all for everything you do. So my question has to do with sick leave ordinances in Austin, San Antonio, Dallas. And I think going into session, there was an assumption wrongly that would have been a slam dunk and that would have been dealt with, and it should have been. Just curious to know why you think it didn't go forward and what we can do differently in the next session to preempt those sorts of encroachments on.
Thanks for that question.
freedom.
Shelby?
Yeah, so I think honestly it just got wrapped up in an argument that it shouldn't have been involved in. The policy was there. The data, the research, it shows why such ordinances shouldn't be implemented. We wouldn't have been the only state to have done so. And the fact that it wasn't a slam dunk was disappointing. The fact that it got so close to the finish line and yet did not pass it was also disappointing. I think looking forward, we just keep working on the research, working on the narrative, make sure that every Texan is aware of why these policies are bad and why their city shouldn't be able to implement such ordinances, because they are not good for the employer, the employee, or the consumer. And for the next 18 months, that is one issue I'm very much looking forward to continue looking forward to and looking into as the litigation against the city of Austin continues.
Thanks for that question and the response, Shelby. And we, as you know, like to end events on time, but that doesn't mean that if you have a question you didn't have a chance to ask, you can't ask it. We'll all stick around in case you want to pose your question. Most of all, on behalf of all of us here at the Foundation, I want to extend our gratitude for the work that you do, for the fact that you would be here in the middle of a business day, and for many of you for making our work possible. For those of you who joined us via live stream, thanks for doing that. Most importantly, let's keep in mind that it's really important when we get these legislative reforms that we recognize that even if there are 100% victories, as a couple of them are, that you have to continue to work on them. Think about tort reform, for example. It's obviously true as well that when there's limited progress, sort of half enchiladas, as many of these examples are, that we go back, and it's hard for conservatives to do this, and go get the other half. And that's what we're going to be doing over the interim, and we look forward to working with you and, of course, the big three and the legislators who take the hard votes. God bless you, and God bless Texas.
Sure, if I take it together.